I'm being very, very responsible for this wrap up, and I have a almost full glass of water. Ignore the fact that it is indeed advertising a brand of vodka. Hello, hello, and welcome to my November wrap up. November was an extremely ambitious month for me. It was the month I decided that I should start running again after several years of not doing that, and I got a fitness tracker, which immediately motivated me to do more sports stuff. I also read 13 books that I'll tell you about today, and I also did half of NaNoWriMo. I stopped at about 28,000 words 2 weeks in because I was like, you know what, this is all I had to say about this particular story. All of that is coming out in a vlog, so this is just me being like, stay tuned, or if you're watching this more than like 4 days after I upload it, hopefully the vlog's there. But otherwise, stay tuned, it's coming. Anyway, let's get into it. Let's get into the 13 books that I read this month. This is gonna go very well. The first book that I finished in November, I was reading on audio, and this was one of the ones that I couldn't put down, and that was Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. It has like just come out, I think a month or two ago, and I think she's kicking herself a little bit that she didn't hold on to the book. If you've read it, you might know what I'm referring to. I do think she's kicking herself for that. But how do I even summarize this book? Because it's pitched about the fact that Naomi Klein in her online life gets confused with Naomi Wolf a lot. They're both investigative journalists of similar enough ages and similar enough beats, but Naomi Wolf has gone into one political direction while Naomi Klein has gone into another. And Naomi Klein gets mistaken for Naomi Wolf in like real life situations on Twitter to the point that it became a joke. And she became quite like fascinated in this phenomenon and with like how much she hated being mistaken for Naomi Wolf and the eeriness of having an actual person be your sort of doppelganger in someone else's head. But then the book moved to talking about very different things, because this is like a kind of one-off phenomenon. But what she seems to explore more, which is something that I'm fascinated by, is how right now the way we consume media, we all consume media very tailored to us. So the algorithm sees, oh, you like to watch BookTube done by 20-something-year-olds. I'm 30 in like a month. By 20-something-year-olds talking about books like this. Let me recommend you some more BookTube videos. And the BookTube videos recommended to you will be different from the BookTube videos recommended to someone else, will be different from the ones recommended to someone else, and we will have this little like microcosm of the kind of entertainment and the kind of information we are exposed to. And Naomi Klein decided to purposefully expose herself to information that she's aware that Naomi Wolf is consuming. So one kind of striking example of this is she began listening to the Steve Bannon show a lot. She does not support any of the views that Steve Bannon talks about, and she was like not really, like, it wasn't her normal infotainment, I guess. But she makes this interesting point that like, well, they're listening to my side, so I want to listen to her side. And then she thought a lot about sides, and she thought a lot about doppelgangers and how they've been used in politics and in literature and in culture to define sides and to give us a way of aligning ourselves. And what this book ends up really touching on is political polarization in the age of the internet and in the age of tailored media consumption and information. It's an interesting book, very worth reading. I gave it 5 stars for how topical it was and how relevant it was to the sort of like some of the ideas that have been cooking in my own head. It's a pretty difficult book to summarize because it really is just Naomi's thoughts and reactions to not just having an active doppelganger, but also like culture wars, COVID, the hyper internet living that we've all sort of tuned into over the past 2-3 years, Twitter wars, AI, etc. So if you're into those topics, you know, if you're into what the heck is the internet doing to us, it's good. I recommend it. 5 stars. The next book that I finished was a leftover from October. I meant to read it as part of like my spooky season October stuff, and that was What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. So the cover is really creepy. It's clearly about a fungus that is reanimating a bunny. How fantastic. And then I found out it was a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher, so I decided to read that short story, and I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed the amount of fungal imagery that was present in that story. So I was like, okay, this is gonna have good vibes. And it just did not land for me. I don't remember if I gave it a 1 or a 2 star, but like this did not land at all. And I was pretty disappointed by that. Just the balance of the elements I was looking for in the book was really off compared to the elements that were actually present. And what I was really hoping for was a lot of like lush imagery and like creepiness. Like the reason fungi are creepy in this context is that they're parasitic. And parasites are terrifying. Parasites, and including like some fungi, cordyceps, etc., will literally take over a like living organism and direct it to do things. There's so much good horror potential there. Like The Last of Us, I think, did it well. I only watched like 2 episodes of it, but I enjoyed what I saw. And I think there's a lot of potential in terms of like fungi body snatching and just like turning other things into like vessels of evil is the best way I can put it. And just this didn't really happen. It kind of felt like there was suspense in the story to be like, ooh, what's going on? And then we finally found out, oh, it's because a fungus has possessed the bunnies and the corpse of this person. And it's like, yeah, I got that from the cover. Like that's your lead. Like why is this suspenseful in the book? That was so I just didn't really enjoy the execution of it. I didn't find it particularly compelling, and I had really high hopes for this. I was disappointed. Sorry. I did find the writing style quite accessible, and like it was fine. I thought I would love this, and I tend to be harsher with books that I thought I would love and then that just fall flat completely. Like I almost didn't finish this. I just did not click at all. So then I finished my 3rd French book of the year. So as I've mentioned on this channel, I've been trying to read en français parce que je parle français, but I don't use my French very much, and I certainly don't read in it. But I now have a job that I do have to use my French now and again, so it's kind of useful to read in it, if only just to like keep the language alive within myself and keep the vocabulary. Prior to this year, I think I hadn't read in French in maybe like 10 years. Not for fun. Actually, I don't know if I've ever read it for fun in French. For school, yes. No, maybe as a child, but yeah. It's been a hot minute, is what I'm saying. So I typically don't want to read like English literature translated into French. I'd rather read it in the original. But in this case, I was reading some Japanese literature, which I can't read in the original, so I read it in French. And that was the book In the Miso Soup, which in French the title is just Miso Soup. So easy peasy. So this is my first book by the other Murakami. I am a reluctant fan of Haruki Murakami, so I wanted to give Ryu Murakami a try. And this book is dark. It is so dark. This book follows a man who works as a tour guide for taking people around the late night district of Tokyo, specifically taking foreigners who speak English and don't speak Japanese, and helping them interact with like people at bars, sex workers, whatever they're looking for within the confines of the red light district. And he's starting a shift around New Year's, a 3-night shift for a client who he gets like a weird vibe off of and can't help but intuitively connect to like a body that was recently discovered in a dumpster that he heard about. So the book very much opens up with the murder of a young woman, but it's off screen, and we just find out that this happened to her. And he's like, he just has this feeling like, what if it's my client that killed her? And it's really like small things that are tipping him off. Like Some of the money that his client passes to him seems to have like a stain on it that's like a stain of blood, and you're just in his head and watching him like be paranoid but also need to like manage his client, but also try to figure out how to spend time with his girlfriend because it's almost New Year's and they were planning on spending time together. His client keeps telling him these like bogus stories that contradict one another. Like at some point he mentions only having sisters, and at another point he mentions only having brothers. He talks about playing baseball all the time, and then he talks about never having played baseball before. These kinds of things. Very innocuous lies, but lies nevertheless. Um, the book takes a really, really strong turn, and the way the turning scene is written is almost comical, and then is just really, I'm looking for a word that's not going to spoil it. Jarring. It's really jarring, I would say. Comical and kind of really jarring, and completely changes the tone of the book. And then the denouement of that, the way that the plot ends up going, is very like, I don't know, it was good. This was a good book. I'm really looking forward to reading more Murakami. The way I would compare him to the more famous, in the West at least, Murakami, is less imagery of cats and moons, more imagery of grime and decay and suspicion. I think it reminded me most, actually, in style, in terms of other Japanese literature I've read, it reminded me of most of Under the Midnight Sun, I think it was called. I forget the author's name off the top of my head, but I'll like put the little picture. This was a really good Japanese thriller that I read maybe a year or two ago, and I have another book by this author on my shelf, and I'm looking forward to getting to it. I think this one's relatively famous, and I'd say if you liked Miso Soup, you'll probably like this, and vice versa. So I think I gave this like a 4 stars. It's good. It's a good book. Read it if you're into like crime and Japanese underbelly and all that kind of stuff. If you've seen some of my videos before, you know that nothing makes me want to read a book more than if I find out that there's some sort of climate apocalypse vibe and some like missing person and weird magical realism and a cover that looks like this. Like, this is a beautiful cover. And I do have to say, the contents of the book are absolutely beautiful. So Things We Found When the Water Went Down is a debut novel, and it's an experimental novel that's formatted as a collection of pages of notebooks, police transcripts, and collages, as well as newspaper clippings, all these kinds of things. So quite literally, it is a collection of things found when the water went down. It tells the story. It's kind of assembled from the perspective of the daughter of a woman who went missing under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and the dynamic between the daughter, the mother, and other members of this town, including some people who have been involved in some form of crime, either as victim or perpetrator. I didn't end up loving this book, but I found it really interesting, and I have no idea how it came on my radar because this is a small publisher and not a very popular book at all. I think it's worth reading for the format alone. If you like epistolary novels, if you like weird books, like I'm not a House of Leaves fan. I didn't end up finishing House of Leaves, but if you like House of Leaves, I could see you really enjoying this. It's a very, very intriguing book, and though I only gave it 2 stars because it was just not really for me, I can really see other people enjoying it, especially if you like piecing things together. It's more of a like treasure hunt of a book, and I do have to say the collages are absolutely beautiful, and some of the social commentary is interesting. There is some like social commentary written in here, almost like in the form of free verse poetry. And again, it's not really my thing, but I know people in my life that I would recommend this to and be like, you're gonna love this, because it's just like outside of my comfort zone so much that it doesn't resonate, but I know that if someone is into this kind of stuff, they'll really like it. Let me know if you've heard of this or if you've read this. Like, I'm trying to find like one other person to talk to about this book because it was an experience. It was truly an experience, and I'm glad I read it, even though it only got like a 2.5 star from me. That's really just a reflection of my own enjoyment, not the quality of the book itself. The quality of the book was very good. It's just my personal sort of, this is how I resonated with it. Okay, so this next one got a 5 star. One of you commented about it, and you told me that if I like All's Well, if I like Bunny, I'm going to like Rouge by Mona Awad. You were right. You were right. I did like Rouge. I listened to it on audio, and even though it was like repetitive at times, which is the main criticism I've heard of it, it's such a quintessentially Mona Awad book that I just loved it. So the concept behind Rouge is we have this imagery that comes up a lot. Imagery around the color red, obviously. Imagery of roses, of jellyfish, of renewal and eternal life, like, you know, the whole immortal jellyfish thing. Of Snow White. There's a lot of Snow White, mirror, mirror on the wall. Coveting beauty. There's also some Beauty and the Beast elements, which ties in with the roses. There's also this like duality element and almost like a doppelgangerism element. It was very interesting to read in such close proximity to the Naomi Klein book because okay, I should tell you what this book is about. Do you want to know what this book is about? Rouge follows the story of Belle, Mirabelle, and her mother. So her mother suddenly dies and Belle goes to the funeral, and she and her mom have not had a good relationship. They've been living apart for several years. Belle's been living in Montreal. Her mom's been living in California. And her mom seems to have been like losing her mind a little bit towards the end of her life, and also getting really into skincare and going to this one like sort of like wellness spa place. And Belle gets like a little bit involved in it, and it gave me the culty vibes that I was looking for when I picked up Cult Classic, which was a book I ended up really not liking. It was really weird. It was really weird. And then just, I don't know how else to present this fact, and I feel like this is not a spoiler anymore because everyone keeps bringing it up in memes. Tom Cruise is in this book. Like, Tom Cruise is a prominent character in this book, which again emphasizes some culty vibes, but Tom Cruise, I cannot emphasize enough, is a important recurring character, and that alone makes this book kind of like, it's like a hilarious fever dream that also made me really sad. And there's some interesting commentary on mother-daughter relations, on beauty, on love, on growing up, the transition from girl to woman, on race, on self-perception. Like, it just sort of, you marinate in the folk tales of it and the themes of it, and even when the book gets repetitive and just goes off the rails, like, the vibes are so good and you're sort of marinating in it, swimming in it like aforementioned little jellyfish. So I really enjoyed this, is what I'm trying to say. I really recommend this. I think I might have liked it a little better than Bunny. I don't know. I feel like I have to reread both. Both of those are books that I listened to, and All's Well I read on paper. All's Well I liked the least out of these three, and I think these three, Mona has referred to them as like her like dark fairy tale trilogy, and they definitely go together in a really nice way. Rouge is structured similarly to All's Well, but All's Well focused on completely different themes. I think a lot of people have compared Rouge and Bunny. I don't know. It was really good. It was really good. I missed the book tour for this, and I'm so disappointed because when I saw that tickets were on sale, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get them later. And then I went to get them later. That was a mistake. That was a mistake because I almost got to see Mona Awad talk about this when she toured here in September. So I'm kind of disappointed about that, and disappointed that I don't have a hardcover signed copy, but you live and learn. I think I need to start going to book signings because I need to know more about what she has to say about this. I'm gonna go hunting for some interviews, actually. Yeah, if you read this and enjoyed it, let's talk about it because This was weird and I loved it, is what I'm trying to say. It was great. I think I've mentioned before that I'm part of a Goodreads Discord that has a book club, and one of our book club picks for the last month was a book that I never would have picked up otherwise. But like I had a pretty good time with it. It was Several People Are Typing. And this book is written entirely in Slack messages, and the Slack bot is a prominent character in the book. I don't think I could have read this if I had been currently actively using Slack at work, but I don't. We're in MS Team workplace now, but I have been in a Slack workplace, so I knew the infrastructure. The premise of this book is that our main character, whose name I now can't remember, it's not Roland, but it's something like that. Gerald. Our main character, Gerald, is trapped inside Slack. And by that I mean is his body, his lifeless body, is just chilling in a coma in front of his computer, and his essence, his soul, has been sucked into Slack and interacts with the Slack bot. And he's getting so much work done, but he can't leave the virtual Slack space. He's uploaded his consciousness into Slack accidentally. Of course, none of his coworkers believe him. Weird stuff starts also happening with his coworkers. One of them keeps hearing wolves howling. Like, this starts off that everyone's snowed in, so everyone's working from home, and they're like, haha, Gerald, yeah, you're stuck in Slack, it's because of the storm, haha. And there's a character who's like, yes, and I hear the wolves howling. They howl outside my window. Like, super creepy and weird. That was my don't forget to eat lunch alarm, so I will do that when I finish filming this video, but that's another like 20-30 minutes. We're fine. I'm not going to keep you that long, don't worry. I edit the stuff down. What was I saying? Yeah, so the Slack messages just start getting weird, and we get access to like the DMs between certain people and get to get a little bit of like the office gossip, and stuff degenerates. It's an experimental novel. It's a really weird format. This is not a novel that I expected to be like, this is the best thing ever. But honestly, I had a good time with it. I had like a pretty good time with it. It was absurd. It was funny. It was lighthearted. In the words of John Scalzi about how he talked about Kaiju Preservation Society, it's not meant to be a symphony. It's a pop song. It's just for fun. It's a bop of a novel. And it really was. I gave this like a solid 3.5 stars. If this sounds at all intriguing to you, it takes like an hour and a half to read because it's a series of Slack messages, and it's like pretty funny. If you enjoy the kind of humor that was present in like Welcome to Night Vale like 10 years ago, wow, I feel old. That was 10 years ago. If you enjoy the kind of humor that was present in like Welcome to Night Vale, for example, I think you would like this. There's a little bit of absurdism, there's a little bit of horror, there's a little bit of strangeness. Also a little bit of doppelgangering coming on. I feel like that Naomi Klein book really just set the tone for the month. Right. This was fun. I'm glad that it came across my radar because I don't think it's a book I would have picked up otherwise. But I really enjoyed it. Next, I finally read Salem's Lot. And the first little bit I was bored because it was just such a Stephen King. It was like a book that aggressively Stephen Kinged about Stephen King. And it was like, here is a writer character. Here's the young woman who's in love with him. Here are Peter and Jack and Mark and all these normal Midwestern people. One of them's the doctor. And I'm like, where are the vampires? I think I was at like 40% of the book. I'm like, I was promised vampires. I was told that if I love Midnight Mass, which is indeed one of my favorite TV shows ever made, I adored it, I need to read Salem's Lot, which is like the foundational text for this genre of a town gets overtaken by vampires. So where were the vampires? When the vampires finally came, I loved this book. I absolutely loved it. I keep being in denial about the fact that I love vampire books, but I have embraced it fully now. I think with Salem's Lot, with the commitment to reading this, I would like, you know what? Vampires are cool. Vampires are fun. These are very classic vampires, exactly like following the sort of classic lore of vampire novels. They like operate in the same, like, they can't go out at night, they're afraid of crucifixes, as the cover implies, all the sort of stuff you expect. And it's just really fun. You follow your ragtag little gang of people trying to fight off the vampires, and a lot of them succumb, and it kind of there's nothing like surprising, I'd say, about this book, but it's what it says on the tin in like a really satisfying way. I ended up giving this 5 stars because I just enjoyed the experience of reading it. Like I said, it was a little bit of a slow start, but if you're willing to tolerate the like extreme Stephen King world building of here is the small Midwestern town with all these regular people, if you're able to read that, because if you've read a lot of Stephen King, you've read that a few times now, it is very worth getting through it to get to the vampire parts because they're just good. Like objectively, they're just good. So this was like pulpy, it was fun. It was like a soft 5-star read for me. And yeah, gotta read more vampire books, I guess. It felt kind of ironic that I'd read about Naomi talking about another Naomi to then read a third Naomi, but I couldn't resist when my hold for the future came in. Oh, and this was good. I listened to this on audio, and I listened to this right as I started getting back on the treadmill. So this was my treadmill book, and it was an amazing book to lose myself in while I was running. So if Naomi Alderman's name rings a bell, it's because she wrote The Power, which was a very, very good but sci-fi speculative fiction book about what if women suddenly were able to electrocute people on demand and effectively become physically overpowering over average men. So shifting kind of the dynamic between the sexes was the idea of that novel. And what are the like socio-political ramifications of that? What happens in a schoolyard? What happens on the geopolitical scale? And it followed all these different characters, and it was wonderful. So in the future, Naomi Alderman also runs with a different premise. What if all the like tech billionaires, the like uber rich, what if they all actually do have a secret bunker in like New Zealand that they can run away to? And the next time there's like a global pandemic that actually wipes us out, or a major massive disaster, or whatever, what if they have built these underground bunkers? What are the implications of that? And this book is just so fun because it has characters who are like not completely obvious like analogs of people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, etc., but like close enough. And it takes place also very much on the internet and in like the conspiracy theory world. There's a cult involved, which is always fun. I can't resist a little bit of cult involvement in a book. And you follow several threads of story, and it's very topical. It references COVID-19 a lot, and I feel like we're just gonna see that over the next like few years in fiction. But I think it does it in an interesting way, and like also socially commenting on some of the phenomena that we saw during COVID-19 and like those early pandemic years, like 2020 and 2021. It really reflects on that response and contrasts it with upcoming fictional responses. It like also talks about class, obviously, because it goes on the uber rich. It also talks about like morality and should humanity be saved? What does that look like? And it also talks about like, are we actually able to use all the tech we have now to build a better world? And what are the ramifications of that? And what is the price of that? Is there a price to that? Is the price worth paying? Very, very topical speculative fiction. This is going to be a contender for one of my favorite books of 2023 because it was just so engrossing. I could not put it down. I've read a couple of like the criticisms of it, which is that like some of the characters were underdeveloped, and I see why, but this was more of a ideas exploration book rather than a character exploration book, at least for me. So that didn't bother me as much. I really loved it. If you're into these like ideas at all, if you are ready to read about COVID in a fiction context, if you're interested in like the dynamics of the uber rich and the implications of the internet and the implications of AI in our lives and global warming and all the stuff that we're talking about as a society in the past few years, this is a really fun fictionalized take on it, and I highly recommend it. I really loved it. And I was just like so blessed in November. Like now I'm talking about these books, I'm like, whoa, I read a lot of bangers. And the next one was this. Okay, I didn't know that I needed a retelling of 1984 from Julia's perspective, but I desperately needed a retelling of 1984 from Julia's perspective. And this was terrifying. Like, this was what I think I wanted The Handmaid's Tale sequel to be. Like, I was so disappointed by The Testaments. I did not like it. I pretend that book doesn't exist. As far as I'm concerned, it was a money grab. I love you, Margaret Atwood, but that was a money grab. This book, on the other hand, Julia, it went into reproductive coercion. It went into women's health. It went into oppressive gender stereotypes and dynamics. It went into like totalitarian regime and looking at all of these sorts of bizarre ways that women are constrained in totalitarian regime, like women as baby incubator versus woman as sex object versus woman as secretary versus. There was some fascinating commentary, and the way that some of the scenes were rewritten, because this book was allegedly like endorsed by the Orwell estate, which is pretty cool, and it was very, very faithful to the original work. And there are scenes that are rewritten, or scenes that obviously stick out and you remember. And just the way that they're rewritten, I was a really big fan of it. I thought it did the original work a lot of justice and also elevated it and provided a really interesting perspective. I'm really very impressed. I'm just really impressed with this book. Again, one of my top contenders. Like, I've read so many good books recently. This was incredible. So if you haven't read 1984, which, like, what are you doing? Go read 1984. It is a very topical classic and a very interesting book. It's a dystopian society that's highly totalitarian, and it follows our main character, Winston Smith, who works for, I want to say he works for the Ministry of Truth, which is like the propaganda portion of the government, and he writes propaganda for the big government that we don't know a lot about, that is led by Big Brother. So Big Brother is watching you, that's the government watching you, where is peace, all this kind of stuff. And Winston starts to betray this government, notably by being enamored with Julia, and they frolic off into a field together, essentially. But when he gets taken and is threatened with torture, the torture being that a cage of rats is going to be like put around his face so that the rats eat his face, because he's terrified of rats, he yells and fully betrays. He yells, "Do it to Julia, not to me, go do it to Julia." And that's one of like the most striking scenes, because this does actually save him. Because the government sort of sees that, like, oh, he's willing to betray the one who led him astray, and therefore he's willing to like come back and be a good agent and citizen of this totalitarian regime. But so what about Julia? And that's what this book asks. And the scenes that precede and follow the "do it to Julia" moment, that was some of the most horrifying writing I've ever read. Horrifying. Like, I was not ready. I was just like sitting there with my jaw dropped, listening to the words and being like, what? 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 It was incredible. It was gruesome and violent and interesting and thought-provoking, and I really want Sandra Newman now to rewrite Brave New World. Like, 1984 and Brave New World are always paired together because they're sort of flip sides. They're two totalitarian regimes that operate very differently, so they're kind of like counter to each other. And now that she's retold one, she needs to retell the other, because there's a prominent female character who gets overlooked in Brave New World, and I think that that would just be so satisfying. So I highly recommend this. Definitely make sure you've read 1984, or at least are like basically familiar with it. I wouldn't say you need to do like a thorough reread before reading this, but having some grounding in what that world looks like is very helpful for getting the most out of this incredible retelling, which I really recommend reading. Like, it is like I said, it is what I wanted from the Handmaid's Tale sequel and more. It exceeded all my expectations, blew me out of the water. 5 stars, obviously. It was great. I do this thing that I've talked about in the past on my channel, which is where I just like borrow way too many books on Libby, and then when the deadline comes, I'm like, all right, time to marathon this. That's what happened with The Art Thief. I started this book 6 hours before it was due, even though I'd borrowed it for 21 days. So I think that tells you a lot about who I am as a person. This was fun. This was like a fun piece of investigative journalism. It follows a self-professed art thief and his girlfriend as they basically drive around Europe with this Bonnie and Clyde fantasy, stealing pieces of art, rescuing them from museums, and bring them back to their attic in France, where they just like lie in bed surrounded by little statues and paintings. And the art thief, he's not interested in selling them. He's not one of those low lives. No, he is just into art and into theft. He just really likes stealing. That becomes pretty obvious. So the book kind of just discusses his crimes and describes them, and also describes how he eventually got caught and what that looked like. The author ended up like interviewing the thief for many, many hours and getting a full story. And because of that, it reads from a really interesting perspective, because the thief is a clear narcissist and like thinks that rules don't apply to him and thinks he's better than other people, all that kind of jazz. And it comes across in the telling. What's interesting is that the tone of the book almost like celebrates some of his actions, or at least early on. But I found it relatively clear that it's not that the author is endorsing it, it's that he's gotten into the head of the art thief and shows how he and his girlfriend ended up rationalizing what they were doing and ended up seeing it as a noble pursuit, essentially. This was quite good. I don't remember if I gave it 3 or 4 stars. Like, it wasn't like mind-blowing or anything, but like it was what it said on the tin. I enjoyed it. The audiobook was relatively short and very pleasant to, again, run to on a treadmill. If you like true crime but have read too much murder true crime, but you're like me and you're not really interested in crimes that are motivated by money or corruption or things like that, I'd say this is a really accessible, non-murder oriented true crime. That it doesn't go into human depravity, it goes into human pride. I think that's what it explores the most, like hubris. Yeah, it's a book that really, really dives into hubris and narcissism and observing what happens when a criminal thinks that he's smarter and better than everyone else. Tokyo Ueno Station has been on my reading list for a little while, and it was just one of those like atmospheric translated Japanese lit that I've seen people on the booktube feed that I have on my Goodreads talk about, recommend it. It reminded me in tone and in pacing a lot of Winter in Sokcho, just in terms of like the writing style. So this book tells the story of a man who is homeless and living in Ueno Park, so close to Tokyo Ueno Station, and he tells the story of his life, which includes a time in his life when he wasn't homeless, when he had a child, and he talks a lot about the birth of his child, which happened to coincide with the birth of like the next emperor of Japan, like the prince. And then he kind of like outlines sort of what went wrong, quote unquote, and some of the tragedies in his life that are like painfully mundane. And what I found really striking in this book was how like subdued and mundane everything was, while also presenting what like homelessness in Tokyo looks like. I had like the great pleasure of visiting Japan in 2019, right kind of before the pandemic in November of 2019. And one of the things I was really struck by was actually the lack of people who were visibly living in the streets. Like that was just not apparent in any of the cities I was in, comparative to sort of what I'm used to seeing in North America and Europe. So that was really striking for me. And then I found out a little bit that it's really because they're driven away and like hidden away as much as possible and really like, pushed out of society. And it was really interesting to read about that in a piece of literature. So that's what I found most informative here. The writing itself is also quite beautiful. Again, in this like subdued way, and nothing much happens. It is very much a no plot, just vibes book, but I think it presents a very, very sad, very harrowing perspective on, I guess, like a forgotten Tokyo citizen. And you really get the sense that he's uprooted and wandering. And I think that's like the choice of title, to have the title named after a train station, is very telling, because it's like he's never anchored anywhere. He's kind of always traveling into his memories of the past, into some of like the memories of the bad things that have happened. At one point, he has to relocate from one portion to the park, to another. There's just this idea of transience and impermanence that it's explored in a really like sobering and tragic way. So this ended up getting like a 3.5 from me. Like, it was definitely an interesting book. It's not like, yeah, it's not revolutionary or anything, but if you're interested in the kinds of themes that I've just discussed, especially that sense of like impermanence, and if you're into sad translated fiction, this is a sad translated book. Recommend it. It was pretty good. This next one I got from the library, but I've returned it by now because, again, I read it like 3 days before it was due, and that was Brutes by Dizz Tate. And this book started off really, really promising. I thought I would enjoy it because it took the bold choice of writing in first person plural. So we here referred to the hive mind of a few teenage girls, and they were watching their town respond to another girl who was missing. And this girl isn't like their friend, she's not particularly popular or anything, but she's the pastor's daughter, and she recently started dating this one guy that these teenage girls, slightly younger than her, are like sort of just fascinated by this dynamic. Like, they're 7th graders, she's an 8th grader. They want to like peer into it, so it's a lot of like, it's very like voyeuristic, and they're like looking from the outside at like all these adults panicking about her being gone. And the book kind of just spirals from there, and then we have this hive mind of maybe 5 or 6 teenage girls, and occasionally we have a chapter written from their perspective 10 or 15 years in the future, where we get a sense of where their lives have gone. And I feel like I'm being very generous to this book when I describe it this way, because I did not like it. I thought that I would, but the shtick of having everything in first person plural, I think, should have been dropped after maybe the initial chapter, because what ends up happening is that you really don't differentiate between the girls. So then when you find out about their future, you don't care. And the future is sufficiently mundane that just like it doesn't really matter. I really, really struggled to stay invested, actually, in any portion of the story. I felt like the story really didn't focus enough on like the missing teenager. Somehow that plot element became really boring, and I had a lot of trouble connecting to this book. It does have a relatively low rating on Goodreads for these reasons. Like, I really enjoy reading 1-star reviews of books I finish, whether I like them or not. And the main reason I see people not liking this one is exactly that the characters are not particularly defined, and we don't get answers. And the reason I see people liking this book, and I will concede to, is that it is very atmospheric. So this book really captures that feeling of like long summer afternoons in a southern state. The book's set in Florida, and it's like teenagers with too much time on their hands. All that said, I wouldn't particularly recommend this, and that's exactly what you're looking for. But I think that was done in a more interesting way in The Virgin Suicides. I really see why it's compared to The Virgin Suicides, because of the voyeurism and the like obsession with someone else you don't know a lot about. But unlike The Virgin Suicides, I feel like there isn't enough substance here to sort of maintain that and keep it going for the bulk of the book. So this ended up being like a 1.5. Like I might have given it 1 star. It really just did not click for me. So I then sidestepped this whole thing completely and went for a horror manga. I've been making my way through the Junji Ito catalog, and it is delightful. Censor is a full novel, so it's separated into chapters. I mean, it's a manga. It took me about 2 hours to read it, and that was going pretty slow. And how do I tell you what this is about without spoiling it? As you might be able to see on the cover, there's some gold. There's some gold threads that are like hairs on someone's head, but also that are not dissimilar from the hairs that are coming from an active volcano that may or may not have consumed a village. Also, God is there, and also a demon larger and stronger than God is there. This is a manga that gets very, very into like the concept of space. At one point, someone turns into just neurons, and I absolutely loved that panel. As a recovering neuroscientist, I was like, this is amazing. Just turns into this like field of neurons, and that turns into the galaxy of space. So if you like that kind of stuff, there's some body horror, there's some weird mystical girls. It's like very typical Junji Ito, and it's really around this community by the volcano. And there's a creepy cult. There were many creepy cults in my November reading, including in Censor. This got a solid 4 stars. Isn't the most memorable Junji Ito ever? No, because I mean a lot of them are just really good. It was just good. Like it was good. Read it. If you like his other stuff, read it. I would even say that this could be a good entry point if you haven't read any other Junji Ito, because it was like not overly gross and quite like coherent as a story, and really weird, but like good weird. Look how much I loved this. This is how much I loved this book. So I took about 2 months to read The House of the Spirits, and I typically don't take that long with a book. I'm spending more than like 1 week with a book. I usually end up DNFing it because it means I'm not interested in it. This one, I started reading it as an ebook borrowed from my library. I ended up getting this used copy, and I ended up rereading like the first half that I'd read on the ebook, rereading from the beginning very slowly in order to annotate. And my annotations are color-coded by which characters appear, because there's 4 really key important characters who just like, they're fully human, and it's amazing. And also some things of like foreshadowing. One of the colors shows foreshadowing because there's so much foreshadowing in this book that's so much like fun. How do I summarize this? This book is all substance. No filler, all substance. Every page, something happens. So it tells the story of a family, starting with Clara, who I think is my favorite character. I mean, she's pretty amazing. She starts off as a young teenage girl or child, having the ability to predict the future and getting kicked out of her church for demonic possession, essentially. That's like the first 2 pages. And then she is someone who can tell the future, but she gets caught in a miserable marriage for a series of reasons that I won't get into because they're worth discovering on your own. And then we follow her daughter, and then we follow her daughter's daughter. And we also follow Clara's husband, so the father and the grandfather. He's a major player. He's a major political player in the book, and there's themes around like politics and revolution and communism, socialism type stuff versus capitalism, but all of that is the backdrop to the more interesting relationships between characters, including parent-child relationships, including romantic relationships, and just some of the imagery that's in here is so like visceral and interesting and just like gripping. I don't even know how to properly explain it. I can give you examples, I suppose, that at one point we're looking for someone's head because we're trying to bury it because the body's already been buried, and our clairvoyant, Clara, knows where this head is, and just the journey of going to pick up said head is described in such like a surreal way. I love it. I loved this so much, and the writing style is so tragic. I think that was the other thing. There were so many passages that would say things like, she didn't realize that this was the last day she would ever be happy. And stuff like that. Like, it is tragic. Or like, she didn't know then that this would be one of the only things that brought her comfort in darker days. And it's like the darker days is like literal torture. It was so good. It was so good. There's earthquakes, there's Zen Buddhism, there's revolution, there's a lot of commentary on the treatment of women, um, and like gender roles and modernization of tech, family honor, family status, family relationships, lost love, revenge. Revenge is a huge topic in here. I don't know how to do this book justice. I don't know how to do this book justice other than like literally reading you my like 50 tabs. I guess what I want to say is this was incredible. I'm glad I got to live in this universe for like 2 months. I read this so slowly, like I'm talking like 10 pages a day because they just consumed me. And like I said, it was all substance. I like needed time to digest it. But I absolutely loved this. If you're into family sagas, this is a must. And don't be discouraged from how slow it goes. Just like enjoy the journey. It is such an incredible journey, and I literally cannot wait to read some more Isabel Allende. I'm really, really excited about it. A few of you have recommended like where I should go next, and I really appreciate that. I don't know like when I'll be ready. I'm not ready right now. I'm not ready. Because I'm still just digesting this, but I loved it so much. So much. This was, of course, 5 stars. Of course. Really, really great book. I just counted, and I think that's like 6 5-star reads. That's pretty impressive. And I think I read like 13 books, so basically half of them were 5 stars. So clearly November was incredible. I just counted it, and I think it was like 6 5 stars out of the 13 books I read. So amazing, amazing batting average as far as I'm concerned. I'm so happy about the books I read. I'm so happy I got to share them with you. I also met my Goodreads goal in November. I wanted to read 2 books a week, so 104 books, and I'm currently sitting a few books past that. So December is going to be a nice free reading month. If you're interested in what I'm reading, I did just put out my December TBR. I know that I'm going to have a really rough time choosing my top books of the year because I can't even choose my top book of this month. I don't know. I don't know. I'd say I'm not sure which one's the top contender. They were all good. They were all good and like different kinds of good, different flavors of good. So this is going to be an impossible decision. So stay tuned for that, I guess. And in the meantime, I hope you have a lovely day and read a really good book soon. Bye.